Um, I'll maybe open then up to Mr. Rogers Dliwayo, who's from the UNDP. And I hope you can switch on your camera, Rogers. I thought I'd turn to you before I open the floor up, and I've seen there are a few more comments, but just sort of some of the thoughts you have. Also, just I think you're in a position to have listened to the input, but also tie it to the SDGs and Agenda 2063.
Yeah, sorry, my internet is a bit the strength is a bit weak, so let me talk with my camera off.
Okay, we can hear you loud and clearly. Thank you.
Yeah. Listening to the discussion, I just want to echo. I want to echo a few points which I could, listening to all the presenters. I think what I can take is, the importance of institutions to achieve, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, the SDGs, and Africa Agenda 2063. But one thing, when I was listening to all the presentation and even the interventions, I also felt there is one element which is actually missing in when we discuss even how can we strengthen institutions and even make sure we build their capacity. And I think, to me, when we look at even development trajectories of even countries, I think the issue of transformative leadership is quite important. And actually, I'm drawing upon the report which was done by the Africa Capacity Building Foundation in 2019 with the theme fostering transformative leadership in for Africa development. And that report highlights that transformative leadership is critical for Africa to achieve Africa Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. And it defines transformative leadership as leadership that brings about positive radical change. And in a development context, it is leadership that endangers widespread demonstrative improvements in people's lives, as evident by rising incomes, longer life expectancies, comprehensive social safety nets, and universal access to social services. And I think, to me, this is really the missing link, that how can we develop this this transformative leadership, and how can we communicate this agenda for transformative leadership, and also foster institutions which can actually create short-term opportunities as an incentive. So, because transformative leadership must inspire and mobilize the population and to deploy their best technological capabilities to implement transformative programs and cultivate the necessary political coalitions to ensure sustainability. Of course, building that transformative leadership, needs substantial resources. It needs quite a number of coalitions. But just to highlight that, I think COVID has brought to the fore the importance of this transformative leadership, because the crisis has actually shown the importance of investing in transformative leadership capacity, the public sector, and strengthen the capacity of public institutions. So the capacity of leaders, government, and institutions more general to sustain the functioning of institutions and make them more resilient to shocks will strongly condition the possibility for delivering the SDGs. Because otherwise, if we don't actually, we may actually end up having a crisis in terms of even achieving the SDGs. We end up having a vicious cycle. So I think, to me, the pandemic is really an opportunity. It offers a current an opportunity to a unique opportunity to reimagine the role of leaders and institutions, to promote new governance norms and shifts to transformative pathways that strengthen resilience and accelerate action to achieve the SDGs. Now, let me end there with these few remarks. Over.
Thanks very much, Rogers. I think you've added to the pool. I'm struck by the importance of us all needing to really distinguish between the capacities and the technical aspects of it and broader capabilities. And so I'm going to leave that at on the issue on capabilities and capacity. I'm seeing a number of comments coming through specifically to Prof. Khan. I saw Marianne had raised a question, and I see this response. Marianne, I want to check, is there anything you want to add to the question you've raised there?
Thanks, Penny. I'm not putting my camera on. Also, I've got an unstable internet, but it's really a great opportunity to engage. And I mean, I think Prof. Khan answered, the settlement, is about power. But as we know, corruption is about abuse of power, and that's what I'm interested in. And so while we need a strong state, a strong developmental capable state to achieve better development outcomes, how do we prevent abuses of that state power? And then just hearing what Carolyn said from the Afrobarometer, that people are scared to speak out. When it comes in the South African context, thinking about factionalism, patronage, there's a violence associated with disrupting some of those, if you like, closed networks. And so I'm just very curious how Professor Khan would comment specifically on the South African context of state capture and corruption, and what is feasible and what is possible in terms of anti-corruption policies.
Thanks, Marianne.
Really interesting. So the problem is that the issues are complicated. So in one of my answers to Marianne, I gave a link to a podcast, which I just did, which is long, but because if you really want to get a feel of how I'm thinking, you should perhaps take some time and listen to it. I'll try and give some quick answers. So the point is, there is a kind of position on the left, particularly, which is really problematic, which says that what you need for development is a combination of industrial policy with a kind of, not quite authoritarian, but a very strong developmental state, right? And that developmental state will then push, these development of capabilities, and then eventually will be. And I think this is really based on a reading of East Asian experience of the South Koreas and China's. And my position in the political settlements approach that I have is that is just as misleading and dangerous as looking at the early English experience and saying what you need for development are checks and balances between every institution and a kind of elite democracy, and then everything will be fine. These are all outlier stories which are based on very specific initial distributions of organizational capabilities, and it worked for them. The challenge is that those models are not actually maybe relevant for South Africa or let alone Malawi. And each country has to find their own roots in terms of those nudges and organizations and progressive movements and how you get from point A to point B. If you try to construct strong states in a context where the distribution of power is already quite adverse and exclusionary, you might actually get extremely bad outcomes. So what you find in a lot of so-called developmental states and authority, and they all come to power saying we are going to fight corruption and we've taken power because the whole system is corrupt and we want to drive development. Every authoritarian or strong state person says that. And many of them produce outcomes which are even worse than the corrupt democracy that they replaced. So the idea is not democracy versus authoritarianism or policy this versus policy that, or is industrial policy good or not. It is, given where we are and we want to have a broader distribution of capabilities and real organizations and a spreading out of power and resources in society, given where we are, what is the best thing that we should do? And in some contexts, that might actually be decentralizing power. In some cases, it might be centralizing power. In some cases, it might be weakening a strong state. In some cases, it might be strengthening a weak state. I don't think we can, so all of those depend on very contextual analysis. And, again, coming back to my story of Afghanistan, one reason why the Western experience in Afghanistan totally failed is that they were trying to impose a centralized state on a country without understanding its tribal structures and its power structures, which the Taliban understood really well. So if you look at the blitzkrieg that they had in the last month, where they took over the whole of Afghanistan in 1 week, it wasn't like the German tanks going from city to city conquering them. Actually, What the West didn't realize is the Taliban were already there. As soon as the Americans flew out, they just walked into the cities and collected the guns and said, we are the government. I mean, so this is where, if you don't have a focus on where the real power is in your society, and you're trying to impose a model coming from, it was a very good model, by the way. The model was one of democracy, centralized government, the Weberian kind of monopoly of violence, all the guns. Actually, it had nothing to do with the starting point. And it didn't realize that the Taliban were deeply entrenched. It was entrenched in the Pakhtun tribal structures. And it was not a kind of outfit based in Pakistan crossing the border and throwing bombs. It was deeply entrenched in the power structure. And not understanding that made had they understood that, their whole strategy of constructing a more secular, more inclusive Afghanistan would have been completely different. So basically what I'm saying is that really dangerous to have any model in your mind. So the issue is not whether we should have more democracy or less democracy. The issue is what instruments do we need to use, given your distribution of power, to make power more broad-based, to make capabilities more broad-based. I just want to make one more comment about this whole issue of capabilities and effective demand, because this is really important. The way we often ask about effective demand is we go and ask people, what do you demand? And people will say the most progressive things when you ask them what they demand. We want democracy, we want no corruption, we are willing to pay taxes. This kind of sounding out of opinion is useful, but we should not rely on that on its own. The best way to identify what people really demand is to look at their behavior. And so what we do is we don't actually ask people what they want or how, what we look at how they are behaving. And you will find that in their behavior, almost everybody in a developing country is violating rules on a regular basis. And some of the time, they are violating these rules, not because they want to, but because there's no other way they can operate without violating these rules. They don't have, the rules are not fit for purpose. The rules are asking people to do things which they can't do. And sometimes they're violating rules, which they're deliberately violating because they're the free riders and thieves, in some cases even criminals, right? Outright gangsters. So there's a whole range of rule violations. So just asking people, do you want delivery? Do you want a good state? Do you want clean government? Do you want a good democracy? Doesn't tell you what the problem is. The very people who want good democracy will go and vote for known criminals, knowing they are criminals, because in their very rational calculation, that person is more likely to deliver to them what they want at the end of the day than someone who is honest and actually in many developing, being honest means you have no power. So people will vote for people who have the power to do things for them in the local community. And those are often known criminals. So the fact that people say something which is very nice doesn't mean that they will actually behave in that way. What we really have to ask is, why are people voting for known criminals? Why are people actually breaking rules on an everyday basis? And some of those problems may be fixable, and some of those problems we may have to park for a later date as that distribution of power gradually changes, because we are nudging in a progressive direction. And I think that really granular understanding of society at different levels is what is missing. And that's, so I think what Afrobarometer is doing is really great stuff, but it's not the basis of action. We have to combine, we know people want a clean society. We know people want a rule of law. We know people want their presidents and prime ministers to be honest. But that doesn't tell us that this demand is effective, because in their daily activity, they are not supporting that. So what is effective demand for me is something else. Effective demand for me is to find people, and they're usually organizations, not individuals, who are already behaving in a different way than others. And so this is always going to be the most interesting thing when you find that. If you find a South African company, which is not one of the big ones, but a kind of medium technology South African, ideally owned by a Black African entrepreneur, and you find that they are actually trying to follow rules in their actual behavior, not in terms of what they're saying. Please investigate that. What are those networks? What are those pressures that are making those people follow the rules? And compare them with the next chap who might be breaking the rules while saying the same thing. They're also saying, we want to follow the rules, but those differences need to be understood. And it's not the case that, so we often have this thing that, politics is corrupt. And if you ask business people, they will say, politicians are corrupt and the bureaucrats are corrupt and they're making us corrupt. And if you talk to the politicians, they will say, the businesses are corrupt, they're making us corrupt. But in fact, what you have is an equilibrium. You know, the politicians could not be corrupt on this scale if the businesses weren't colluding. The businesses could not be corrupt on this scale if the politicians and bureaucrats weren't colluding. This is an equilibrium. So when there's an equilibrium, and you go and ask people, they will always give you one side of the story. You need to go and get the full story of how this equilibrium is maintained, because this is not a question of political will. It's a question of a political equilibrium. And it's, you know, you can replace the whole political elite in your country and come up with a completely, you yourselves, you can put yourself in that position. 3 years or 5 years time, you will be behaving exactly the same way, because you will have to do those things to keep the power, to keep in your positions, to deliver the things that you think needs to be delivered. So this is the tragedy of it, right? The tragedy of it is not about good people versus bad people. It's about system equilibria that we're trying to change. And there are endless stories of good people who have led anti-corruption movements, who have deposed pre-existing governments, taken power, and then when they have to face, how am I going to deliver electricity? How am I going to deliver water? How am I going to deliver the teachers to the schools? And they find that all these processes are embedded in corruption. They then become corrupt. So before you take power, you need to know what's the problem. How do you is the problem of delivering teachers to schools that you are corrupt and the teachers are not? Or is it that you have a society where many non-qualified teachers are politically connected and demanding jobs and will force themselves into jobs? And if you want to stay in power, you have to give them jobs. It's both, right? So you have society which has low capability, which is asking from the state things which are actually rule violating, and states which are colluding in that. And then everyone then goes and takes their own piece of the action, and everyone is therefore part of the problem. So it's not a question of good or bad. It's finding the most promising kind of fissures in which to have the interventions which are going to nudge things on. And that's where I think the action is. That's where, the Chinese and the South Koreans did it. And the Chinese had this famous phrase, which is that you cross the river by feeling the stones. You don't know where the potholes are in the river, and you're crossing it on foot. Yeah, so you feel for the pebbles, you feel for the stones with your foot and say, okay, this is where I can step. And if I go there, I'm going to fall. If I go there, I won't fall. That's pragmatic way of crossing the river by feeling the stones is what we are also talking about. There is no magic wand which will solve all the problems. It's deeply entrenched. It's largely endogenous. There are no good guys and bad guys. There are some really terrible people who are the thieves and the criminals, but actually they are not the problem. The real problem is the systemic equilibrium in which the societies are.
Thanks, Prof. Khan. So, come on, I'm waiting for hands because everybody must have been triggered by some ideas just with the comment around systemic equilibrium. So please, I encourage you to raise your hands. I can call on you and give you a chance to input. I know if you don't know how to raise your hand, you can type a note to me in the chat box. But I have seen, Carolyn, you have noted that you'd like to say something. So please come, please, you've raised your hand.
Yes, I did that also. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what Professor Khan said, about Afrobarometer and what the findings actually say. I mean, I think, to be honest, that it dismisses the public perspective on this a little bit too easily. I mean, people have competing desires and demands, and they have to deal with the situation they face. I mean, and just to give an example, we find strong support across the continent for 2-term limits, and yet, and in some countries that has actually led to significant protests. I mean, Condé in Guinea faced significant protests in response to his 3rd-term efforts. The public failed in holding him back, and whereas in Burkina Faso they were more successful. But what you see time and again is that when publics fail in stopping those efforts, even in often there's elections aren't as free and fair as we'd like to see, but even in a fairly free election, that incumbent may then go on to win re-election, and we see that all over the world. Well, people the only thing they want isn't term limits. They also want stability, they want security, they want other kinds of things. I think you have the same thing a lot in terms of what we say about, corruption and what people want. I mean, they may vote for that person who has been very corrupt. It's partly because they don't have other choices or better choices, and that they don't have ways to make their voice better heard. They don't have ways to express those desires in ways that are safe and concrete for them. But at the same time, it's a real public sentiment that I think can be tapped into and isn't being tapped into. I mean, people really don't want to have to pay bribes, and they would rather be in a society where they don't have to do that. That doesn't mean that simply happens. It doesn't mean they won't ever vote for somebody who isn't corrupt, but it is a real public sentiment that is strong and that's there, and that we need to be finding ways to tap into that, and to help foster that and advance that and make it a reality. So I think it's a little too simple to dismiss that because people vote for a bad person. There's a lot of competing interests and a lot of different things going on, but it's a real thing that we should try and tap into.
Thanks, Carolyn. Point taken, that just in terms of the complexity of teasing out what is happening in a local level and giving voice, sort of listening to what citizens say and considering that a bit more deeply. I think that's how you sort of pushing for. Ruben, I saw you've typed something into the chat, but I think I have 2 more minutes or so maybe I can give you the floor, Ruben.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Can hear you loud and clear.
Prof. Khan, I'm quite interested in the statement you've made about political equilibrium. And I'm interested to know whether civil society and the media are also caught up in this collusion that you mentioned, or do they have a role to play in ensuring that all the parties, whether it is the politicians, the businesses, or the bureaucrats, do not get into this equilibrium?
Can I answer directly?
Yeah, sure.
So I think this is a really, really important point, and it connects to what Nick Cheeseman, I think, told you guys on a different session about the problem of signaling, right? So the issue is, I think what we need is everyone to be on track with the same messaging. Civil society, the media can play a really powerful role if they put pressure on politicians, bureaucrats, businesses, whichever policy area you're looking at, to do something for which there is some support within that activity, which can be delivered, which will improve outcomes and which will improve welfare. If, on the other hand, the media and civil society are demanding things which are actually not achievable, then you create demoralization and you get this complete apathy and hopelessness eventually in society, where people give up and say, we have this massive corruption problem, massive governance problem, massive weaknesses of our democracy, and whatever we try, we keep failing, right? And what I find in a lot of my travels across developing countries is this apathy and this hopelessness is the most dangerous thing that you can achieve, because it results in people giving up hope and then becoming targets for extreme populist kind of approaches, which is completely unscientific, not based on any data, saying everyone is it's a huge conspiracy to keep us poor, and the whole world is conspiring, so we need to break out by blowing everything up. This is what we have to avoid. So if you go, so think of what happened in the Arab Spring in Egypt. And I use that as a very powerful example, right? People went out on the streets and said, we have a corrupt government, we need to throw it out. And they didn't ask what are the solvable problems and what are the difficult problems and how do we deliver food and how do you deliver. So when you overthrew Mubarak, you have a government which then won, which was unable to deliver lots of things, got trapped in a completely different agenda of how to construct a more Islamic society, and then was overthrown by the same people who had gone out against Mubarak, the middle class who wanted, good rule of law, came and supported the replacement of the democratically elected government with Sisi, who is a worse kind of, more authoritarian, less liberal than Mubarak. And the whole thing is, these stories of cycles of, massive uprisings, and then you go back to square one and sometimes to square minus one, is what we absolutely must avoid. So I think civil society, signaling, media are very powerful tools if we can mobilize them with good research, and we can tell them, look, these are the things that you should be really shouting about because they're achievable, They can be pushed for. You can create coalitions to demand them. You can create delivery. And then people see success. And when you see success, there's nothing like success. You improve the health system in your locality. You improve power supply. You improve clean water. You improve jobs. You create more businesses. Then people say, this is an agenda I can get behind. This is the anti-corruption agenda. And that's what anti-corruption means in successful countries. Whereas if you have this kind of millenarian kind of approach that, we have this, I'm not saying any of you are saying that. I'm saying this is a real danger and a misunderstanding of what good governance and taking on the state capture can mean. And it is not completely beyond the kind of your experience that sometimes the winners from these might be extreme populists who then use this kind of confusion and desperation for agendas which actually are even less likely to work. And by the way, this is not anymore a developing country problem. You have Trump in the US who might come back again. You have the growth of these populist movements in Europe. You have the growth of fascist parties in Europe, right? People they're not getting the system to deliver. All the questions that Afrobarometer is asking in Africa, if you ask European voters, are you happy with your politicians? Are you happy with the experts? Are you happy with delivery? You will get not very dissimilar answers. People are not happy. It's just that we don't know what to do about this unhappiness, because the really difficult task is to convert that into effective and deliverable policy. And we as intellectuals and academics, our job is to come up with deliverable, feasible policies, which will take some of this anger out and create more equal, more inclusive, and dare I say, happier societies. No one is happy now. You could be in Britain and you're not happy now. And I think it's true that in South Africa, the issues are much more severe than in Britain. But this exact same problem, that politicians are thieves, they are only looking for themselves, this is universal, and this is what brings in the Trumps of the world, unless you are careful.
Thank you so much. Let me say thanks to Penny for moderating that, and Mabel and Brian really for introducing the topic. I'd like to really thank all the participants really for a very exciting, very active and energetic discussion. Very stimulating, not only for me as a South African, but me as an African, because the challenges that we're talking about are complex, and they are disturbing. They are challenging to all of us policymakers, academics interested in policy and implementation, and particularly those of us who are interested in development and democracy. And I think the discussion today was rich in trying to contextualize the debate in not just an African context, but in a development context. So too often has the debate that emerges from analytical frameworks that are developed in the North that reflect the context of Northern economies, who have themselves been through a long history of economic development and social development, and their particular institutions reflect the stage of development of those countries. And I think a little bit about the work of Karl Polanyi, who wrote another book called The Great Transformation, about really the long struggle of European countries and other northern countries to build the market-based economy that they have today. And I think that such a book on the long struggle that countries in the world have gone through to build democratic institutions will also be useful. And for our purpose, what we'd like to do is really draw on the debate, the ideas that Professor Mushtaq Khan talked about, that he himself has been engaging with. And for African scholars working in our own context, our own case studies, our own societies and their histories reflect on the debate that has been taking place in the global space, in the academic space, in the literature, enrich the debate with African perspectives, drawing on our own experiences. And I think this is what this research program wants to do. And we're indeed very privileged today to have Mushtaq Khan, who is a great scholar and who has also not only worked in, he himself comes from Bangladesh, worked in many other developing countries, but has also been working in several African countries. So we would like to thank all of you for joining us today in this discussion, and particularly those who are keen to work together with the Mandela School, the ISS, Afrobarometer, DGRU, the Center for Democracy and Development in Nigeria and in Ghana, and the Dalla Umar Institute. I thank all of you for joining us in this process, and potentially our partners who will be working with us on the research, the OSF and Carnegie. Thank Zainab Usman really for her support for this project when I first raised it with her a few months ago, and for introducing me to some of your colleagues on the continent. Thanks to all of you for this. We will be drafting really a broad outline, just an outline of a research strategy, which we will put to you, the partners, and the potential donors for this project at the next meeting tomorrow afternoon. So thank you so much.